All right. Well, thanks so much for the invitation to present. My name is Michael Osland. I'm a research ecologist at the USGS Wetland and Aquatic Research Center in Lafayette, Louisiana. Much of my work is focused on coastal wetland ecosystems and their responses to climate change and sea level rise. But a portion of my work is focused on winter climate change and the ecological influence of freeze events and winter temperature extremes. And that's the part of my research program that I'm going to be presenting today. I'm going to be presenting on warming winters and their effects on mangroves and other tropical plants marching north. Next slide, please. So the information I'm going to present is mostly covered by these three papers. All three of these have been published in a journal called Global Change Biology. And if anybody in the audience wants a copy, they can send me an email. The first paper is a general review on a topic that's called tropicalization, which refers to the poleward range expansion of tropical cold sensitive plants and animals in response to winter climate change, specifically warming winters. This review includes a diverse group of co-authors, which produce sections on terrestrial plants, coastal wetland plants, coastal fishes, sea turtles, terrestrial reptiles, amphibians, manatees, and insects. The common theme among the co-authors and sections is a focus on the influence of extreme freezing and chilling events on poleward range limits, which is a very important topic for Florida. The second paper focuses specifically on mangrove range expansion at the expense of salt marsh. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that in the middle of the talk. And then the third paper focuses on winter climate change and the range expansion of Brazilian pepper, which is a problematic invasive non-native plant that's very common in Florida. Next slide, please. All right, so here's a figure that sums up the tropicalization concept. The colors on this map reflect extreme minimum temperatures. So that's the coldest temperature that occurred during a 30-year period. Here it's 1980 to 2009. Tropical cold sensitive species in this region tend to be restricted to the areas shown by the warm colors on this map, the yellows, the oranges, and reds. Due to warm winters, these species are expected to move northward at the expense of temperate ecosystems and temperate cold tolerant species to the north. The photos in this figure show some of the species that are focused on in this review. These are all tropical cold sensitive species. They include native species like mangroves, manatee, and snook, but also problematic invasive non-native species like Cuban tree frogs, Burmese python, and Brazilian pepper. Next slide, please. So these photos show some of the effects of extreme cold events. One is of a stunned iguana, which is common in South Florida. The upper right photo is of cold stunned sea turtles in St. Joe Bay in North Florida. The lower left photo is of a fish kill that occurred in Pensacola, and the lower right photo shows freeze damage to citrus. I included the figure on the right just to highlight the point that these extreme events that I'm talking about are infrequent in this region. Most of our winters are fairly mild, but every now and then we get one of these extreme events. The data in this figure are from a climate station in Central Florida. The gray zone is a generalized cold damage and mortality zone where an organism is damaged or killed by an extreme cold event, like the photos in this figure. The x-axis shows minimum annual temperature. Again, that's the coldest temperature across a 30-year period. And then, oh no, here it's the annual temperature. So it's the coldest temperature during a year. And then the blue line shows the number of years containing that temperature, and note that the peak is outside of that gray zone. The red line shows the return interval. So most winters in our region are mild, but we can get these ecologically significant extreme cold events that occur every 20 to 30 years. Those are the events that are within that gray zone in the figure. Next slide, please. All right, so here's a figure that illustrates the potential effects of warming winters on climatic zones and species range limits. The top panel shows zones in the recent past. The lower three panels show the position of climatic zones under alternative future scenarios, specifically a +2, a +4, and a +6 degrees C increase in winter temperature extremes. Note that the northward movement of the warm colors, those warm colors, the yellow, oranges, and reds are that tropical cold sensitive zone. So those warm colors show zones that support the tropical cold sensitive species covered in this talk. And the northward movement of those climate zones will create opportunities for the range expansion of tropical cold sensitive species. Next slide, please. So this next slide examines alternative range expansion pathways. Not all species will be able to move and adapt with climate change. This figure illustrates 4 different pathways for range expansion. The x-axis shows years, and the y-axis shows latitude. The four different lines show alternative pathways. Many species won't be able to expand poleward, as shown by line D. So that's that straight line on the bottom. Line C shows a species that expands and contracts in response to extreme events. So those expansions are during freeze-free years, and the contractions are during following a freeze event. We expect that C may be the pathway for many species capable of long-distance dispersal, including mangroves and other invasive plants. Line B shows a continuous expansion pathway, and line A shows a path that occurs in steps. A good example for this path could be an invasive species like Cuban tree frog that is transported long distances within ornamental plant shipments. Next slide, please. All right, so the previous slides were meant to provide a general and broad overview of the tropicalization concept. Now I'm going to spend some time talking specifically about mangroves. So living in South Florida, I think most of the audience is pretty familiar with mangroves. Mangroves are plants that thrive in coastal wetland environments. They provide many important ecosystem goods and services that are critical to coastal communities. There are 3 common mangrove species in our region: the black mangrove, the white mangrove, and the red mangrove, and their range limits are shown on the map on the right. Extreme freezing and chilling events govern the northern range limits of mangroves. The black mangrove, the scientific name is Avicennia germinans, is the species that is most freeze tolerant and the species that extends furthest north into Louisiana, Texas, and North Florida. To the north of mangroves, salt marshes are more freeze tolerant and dominate coastal wetlands. Warm winters are expected to enable mangroves to move north and replace salt marshes. And the map shows mangrove expansion hotspots in the region, in North Florida, Texas, and Louisiana. Mangroves have been expanding in North Florida and Louisiana since the last major freeze events that caused landscape level mortality occurred in the 1980s. Next slide, please. So to anticipate and prepare for future changes due to warming winters, we need to better understand the tipping points or thresholds for mangrove range expansion. Here's a figure that illustrates the tipping point using what are called ball and cup diagrams. The tipping point or threshold is shown in red by that red oval. It's the zone where small changes in temperature can lead to large ecological changes. In this case, colder temperatures can lead to salt marsh dominance, and warming temperatures can lead to mangrove dominance. The valleys in this figure are included to show that once a coastal wetland is in one of these zones, it becomes more difficult to get back up that peak to reverse the change. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's the quantification of that. So here's a figure that quantifies the tipping point for mangrove range expansion. These data are from Florida's coastal wetlands. So the x-axis shows the minimum temperature during a 30-year period, and that temperature data is from Florida. The y-axis reflects mangrove versus salt marsh dominance. And so that's the percentage of tidal saline wetlands dominated by mangrove forests from 0 to 100%. Mangroves are dominant in the points that are between 50 to 100, and salt marshes are dominant near 0. So wetlands in South and Central Florida are mostly in the upper right. Wetlands in North Florida are in the lower left near the 0. So for those in the audience, your favorite coastal wetland in South Florida would be one of those points in the upper right of this figure. The transition from marsh to mangrove occurs around -7 degrees Celsius, and the zone of instability occurs between -7.6 to -6.3. The take-home message from this threshold in this figure is that small changes in winter temperature extremes, specifically temperatures near -7 degrees C, can lead to big changes for coastal wetlands in Florida and the rest of the southeastern United States. This is critical information for anticipating and preparing for mangrove range expansion in a warming world. Next slide, please. All right, well, so why is this important? Why should we care about mangrove range expansion and vegetation changes in coastal wetlands? So beyond just the ecology, why does this matter for humans and coastal communities? Well, one of the reasons is that coastal wetland plants like mangroves and salt marshes are foundation species. Due to the flooding and salts, coastal wetlands are stressful environments and most plants and animals cannot survive in coastal wetlands. However, mangrove and marsh plants thrive in coastal wetlands where they play a critical ecological role. They're called foundation plant species, which means that they're species that create habitat, they modulate ecosystem processes, and most importantly, they facilitate the development of entire ecological communities. Next slide, please. Changes in vegetation can lead to changes in ecosystem goods and services. Coastal wetlands provide many important ecosystem services and are frequently ranked among the most valuable ecosystems on the planet by economists. Some examples of the ecosystem services provided by coastal wetlands include coastal protection from winds, waves, storms, and erosion, sequestration of carbon from the atmosphere, which gets stored in soils and plant material. Coastal wetlands store more carbon below ground than most other ecosystems across the planet. Coastal wetlands provide important habitat for many fish and wildlife species. Coastal wetlands are often called nature's kidneys due to their ability to remove sediments and nutrients, which improves water quality. Coastal wetlands provide energy and habitat, which supports coastal food webs, which supports the seafood industry. Louisiana is a prime example of this. And lastly, coastal wetlands provide recreational opportunities. So marshes and mangroves are both valuable ecosystems, but the shift from a grass-dominated wetland to a mangrove-dominated wetland can affect some of these ecosystem goods and services. Some of these changes are positive and some are negative. Thus, there are trade-offs in the ecosystem services associated with mangrove expansion. If anyone in the audience is interested in learning more about this topic, we recently published a review that examines the impacts of mangrove range expansion on ecosystem goods and services, and I'd be happy to send it to them. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk quickly about Brazilian pepper. And this is from a study that examined the effects of winter climate change on a tropical invasive tree called Brazilian pepper tree. There are many tropical cold sensitive invasive plants in Florida whose range limits could be affected by winter climate change. Brazilian pepper is a prime example. Next slide, please. Brazilian pepper has become the most widespread invasive plant species in the state of Florida. It was introduced from Brazil as an ornamental plant in the 1800s. It escaped cultivation in the mid-1900s and has now spread across much of South and Central Florida. Millions of dollars are spent each year in Florida managing Brazilian pepper. This slide shows the distribution of Brazilian pepper and those stars and also the corresponding temperatures. Next slide, please. So we conducted a similar study as for mangroves and identified the tipping point for Brazilian pepper expansion. And so that threshold occurs around -11 degrees C. Next slide, please. And we were able to use that to illustrate the effects of alternative future climate scenarios on Brazilian pepper range expansion. So if you pay attention to the reds here, that's probability of Brazilian pepper presence. And you can see under those alternative scenarios, the probability increases to the north. And this is important because from a management perspective, this is information that can be used by managers to the north of the current Brazilian pepper range for early eradication. So they can keep an eye out for Brazilian pepper and managing it quickly before it becomes a problem. Next slide, please. So, all right, the take-home message here is that there are a lot of tropical cold sensitive species in our region that can respond and that can expand their range poleward in response to warm winters. And next slide, please. But it's important to remember that not all species will be able to adapt and keep up with climate change. There are these alternative range expansion pathways. Some species will be able to keep up, others will not. And for most species, it won't be a linear continuous process. All right, next slide, please. So I think we have some time for questions. And if anybody isn't able to ask their question and wants to get in touch with me, here's my email address. Thank you so much for the invitation to present.
All right, so the first one is, hi, Michael, what can we do as a wastewater utility to help in the effort for the mangroves? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, so that's a good question. And a lot of it, mangroves are affected by a lot of different aspects of climate change. And I didn't talk about sea level rise, which for areas where mangroves are already present, that's the biggest driver and aspect of climate change that will affect mangroves. And so planning for resilience, for areas that mangroves can migrate to move landward and adapt to sea level rise, that's probably the most important thing. And then from a larger climate change perspective, any actions that we can do to limit the amount of global climate change will also, from the perspective of range expansion, reduce the amount of expansion. Okay, so then should I go on to the next question, Jennifer?
Yes, please.
Okay, so what is the impact of sea level rise on mangroves? So I just talked about that briefly. So mangroves have the potential to adapt to moderate rates of sea level rise. They're very resilient ecosystems. However, under the highest rates of sea level rise, there's the potential that mangroves can be converted to open water where they are now. Where they have space to move landward, they can adapt by moving landward into adjacent ecosystems. And I would say sea level rise is the biggest threat to mangroves within the context of climate change. Wow, the questions just keep coming. All right, the next question, will loss of salt marsh mean loss of fish species that use it as habitat? So with mangrove expansion in a marsh, there's often a trade-off. And so there are some fish species that will benefit from that transition and others that will be negatively affected. So I wouldn't say that it's a negative or a positive, it's more of a trade-off. And if you're interested more in that review, there is a section on fish. Is there a statewide Brazilian pepper eradication program? Gosh, I have that in the paper. Florida has been the most proactive in terms of Brazilian pepper management. Other states in our region are not as active because it's not as big of a problem. But Florida has been very proactive. I wouldn't say that there's a statewide eradication program because that would be impossible. All right, so I think we have another, should I just keep going, Jennifer?
Yes, we're actually running a little bit ahead, so feel free to answer a few more.
Okay, I'll just keep going and you can stop me when time's up. So many resource managers are promoting the persistence of salt marsh. Does it make more sense to promote mangrove expansion? That's a good question. And from my experience working in Tampa Bay when I was a postdoc, mangroves are much more common there. And so a lot of restoration projects tended to prioritize marshes. And they support different ecosystem goods and services. So I wouldn't say that it makes more sense. It really depends. And in the Northern Gulf, I would say it makes more sense to promote salt marsh. There's several reasons for that. During restoration, marsh grasses expand more quickly than mangroves. And so oftentimes marsh or wetland restoration efforts start with marsh and then mangroves can appear naturally through natural recruitment. Okay, black mangroves are encroaching on the salt marshes of St. Augustine. Should it be considered an invasive species? What is more productive, a pristine salt marsh or a mangrove forest? That's a good question and one that I commonly get. I don't refer to it as an invasive species. It is aggressively expanding into areas that it hasn't been in the past, but it's not a non-native species. And so that's an important distinction to make. In terms of the productivity, a lot of that is covered in that review. In terms of biomass, there's more above ground biomass in mangroves than compared to marsh, but they're both very productive ecosystems. And so in terms of productivity, I would say that they're fairly similar. All right. Why are Brazilian pepper trees so bad? That's a good question. And I had that in my talk, but I was running short on time. So Brazilian peppers trees outcompete native ecosystems. And so they have traits that make them highly invasive. And so once they get established, they can outcompete native plant communities and negatively affect wildlife. Are mangroves or salt marshes more efficient on removing nutrient pollutants? That's another section that's covered in that review. And I would say we don't know enough about that question. There hasn't been enough research directly comparing the two to address whether there's an effect on a positive or a negative effect on water quality. In a lot of ways, both mangroves and marshes, they're both super important ecosystems. And it's difficult to say if one is better than the other, and a lot of it is location dependent. It often involves trade-offs. So you trade off one ecosystem service for another. All right, would it make sense to introduce Caribbean plant species to create resiliency? I'd have to know about the specific plant. In most cases, I think there's a risk of planted species beyond their range limits. And even in the case of mangroves, I'm not a supporter of planting mangroves beyond their range limit to facilitate and speed up that expansion. So I would tentatively say no to that question. Will increased drought in the temperate zone limit tropicalization? Yes, I just spoke about one aspect of climate change. There are interactions between climate change, and drought has the potential to, specifically for coastal wetlands, increase salinity, lead to hypersaline conditions, which can lead to vegetation die-off. And the last one is a thank you. Well, thank you. Those are great questions. Thank you so much for your attention, and those are really interesting questions.